That makes it easier for Henrik when he wants to point. So welcome to these Zeuthen lectures with Henrik Kleven from Princeton University. The lectures are named after Frederick Zeuthen, who was a great economist at our department in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Zeuthen made important contributions to labor market theory, for example, the determination of wages, and does in this way connect to the lectures this year on understanding earnings differences between women and men. The Zeuthen lecture this time is not only a great scientist, Henrik is also a previous colleague of our department, and he's an external member of Center for Economic Behavior and Inequality at the department currently. Henrik got his PhD in 2003 from this department with a thesis on taxation, time allocation, and economic efficiency. He continued his career at the department afterwards, but he was often away. As a junior researcher, Henrik had longer research visits at Princeton, at Columbia, and at Berkeley. In these early years of Henrik's career, I was actually lucky to work a lot together with him and learned a lot, and also we had great fun. Henrik also contributed to the greater fun of the department. I can remember a Christmas lunch, for example, where we were actually dancing on top of the bar, trying to learn everybody the right steps, right? In 2007, he then moved. Copenhagen and this university was too small for him. He went to London School of Economics, I guess the best department in Europe, right? And was fast promoted to associate professor and then full professor. In 2017, he took a big move to the US and became full professor at Princeton University. Henrik has a long CV, so yeah, that's a lecture in itself, right? But let me just mention that he has been a chief editor of Journal of Public Economics. He's now a co-editor of the American Income Review, sort of the really top of this profession. Henrik has worked a lot on how to design tax and welfare systems. This goes from theoretical work on trying to characterize what does this look like, and also to empirical evidence, trying to identify what is super important here, the behavioral responses to taxes and welfare policy. He has also done methodology contributions. He has a QJE paper on using notches for empirical identification, sort of the really new way to do use the bunching approach. In recent years, he has moved to another area, namely understanding gender inequality. And it's exactly this type of research that he will now, here in these lectures, give us some insights into. And Henrik, thank you so much for coming here today. It's a big pleasure, and the board is yours. Let me... Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, Klaus, including reminding me of our experiences at the various Christmas lunches at the University of Copenhagen. It's really great to be back here to give these lectures. I remember attending them back in the late 90s and early 2000s when I was a student here, and later on as an assistant professor. And I had never really thought of the possibility that I would be back at some point to actually give them. So that's really a special experience. Thank you so much for having me and for coming here to these lectures. So I'm gonna share with you some of the things that I've been thinking about in the last 5-6 years related to understanding gender inequality in the labor market and how that relates to children and parenthood. And so the overall, the fundamental questions we're interested in here relate to some really big picture questions that I think many of us frequently think about and discuss, and to sort of indicate that, I thought I wanted to start with these sort of very high-level quotes here from a book that you may have read by Yuval Noah Harari called *Sapiens*. So these two quotes really go to some of the fundamental questions that we're ultimately interested in. The first quote is about the hierarchy of gender, which includes the fact that in most places and at most times, men tend to have careers, make most of the money, and run countries, while women tend to take care of the home and the children. In other words, the so-called breadwinner, homemaker institution. The second quote has to do with what are the basic explanation or what are the roots of this institution. Is this something deeply rooted in biology, or is it a social construction? Is this just something we made up, somewhat like the caste system in India or the racial system in America and in other places? Now, what I'm going to do today and in the following lectures is to put a lot of numbers on the homemaker breadwinner institution. I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about how, or a lot about how it varies across space and across times and at different levels of development. And then I'm going to try and investigate a little bit what are the fundamental mechanisms that drive this institution. I won't be able to give you conclusive answers to these two high-level questions up there, but I hope to be able to at least present something suggestive that points in a direction for future research on this question. Okay, so given that general motivation, I think it's useful to just think a little bit about, or reminding ourselves how gender inequality in the labor market has evolved over the course of economic development. So this graph up here shows on the left the gender gap in earnings, and on the right the gender gap in employment at different levels of GDP per capita. And so the good news is that unlike, for example, income inequality or wealth inequality, which have been on the rise in recent decades, gender inequality goes down with development. The gender gap in earnings has fallen from about 65% to about 35% as GDP per capita goes from $5,000 to $50,000. And the gender gap in employment has fallen even more from about 50% at low levels of development to only about 5% in the most developed countries. Now, another thing that's changing over the course of development is fertility. And there are two components to these fertility changes. One is that women have fewer children over their lifetime, and the other one is that women have children later. So the first one is shown on the left, where you can see that lifetime fertility falls to more than 6 to less than 2 as GDP per capita goes from less than 5,000 to about 50,000. And on the right, you can see that one implication of the fact that women have children later is that if you look at the fraction of women in childbearing age who have kids, that fraction goes down over time from about 60% to close to 30% the course of development. So these are two stylized facts, and the question is whether they are linked, and specifically whether the changed fertility is partly responsible for the changes we see in gender inequality over time. So that's essentially the type of question that we're motivated by here. How much of gender inequality can be explained by children or parenthood? Now, as I'm going to talk a lot about, crucial to answering that question is the concept of the child penalty, which is the title of this lecture, also known as the motherhood penalty, which simply is defined as the causal impact of having children on outcomes, typically labor market outcomes, on women relative to men. And so I'm going to present a lot of evidence about the magnitude of this child penalty and how it varies and why it's there. So once we have zoomed in on the child penalty, there is a bunch of ancillary questions that I'm going to come to. One is, how do we put numbers on it? How do we estimate it? How large is it? How does it vary across time and space? and then maybe the most intriguing one, what are the underlying determinants of it? So essentially, what I'm saying here is that, I guess you can't really see the titles of these slides, but there's nothing I can do about that, I guess. So what we're interested in here, in other words, is to estimate the causal impact of having children on stuff. Now, that is by no means a new question in the social and sciences or in economics. Economists have thought about how to estimate the causal impact of children on stuff for many, many decades. And so somehow what I'm going to talk about today relates to that long intellectual history of work. The focus here is a little different because I'm going to represent everything in the form of these child penalties, but it is closely related. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through that intellectual history, but I need to, I think, provide a little bit of context for what I'm talking about relative to that previous work. So what people have been very concerned with over time in providing answers to this is the fact that fertility choices are endogenous. People decide to have children for all sorts of reasons. And so when we see this correlation that I showed you between fertility and gender inequality, we're not sure if fertility is actually impacting gender inequality, or conversely, if it's gender inequality impacting fertility, or if it's a third set of factors that are driving both. And most likely, it's a little bit of all of it. And so we're trying to tease apart from these patterns what is really the impact of having a child on inequality. Now, so people have thought about this for a long time, being worried about this endogeneity issue. And so what people did was they tried to find sources of random variation in fertility. So as always, the research ideal is to set up an experiment in which we randomly allocate children to people. Absent such an experiment, people have been trying to find things in observational data that essentially replicate that. And there are some really clever examples of that in the literature. One of the most famous one is to use a sibling sex mix, as I have there on the slide. So the idea there is to note two things. One is people like variety. So most parents prefer to have both boys and girls instead of just one or the other. So that's the first one. And the second one is that the sex of your children is virtually random. And so that means that the sex mix of the first two children is essentially a source of random variation in the likelihood of having a third child. And you can see that in the data. People who have two of the same the first time are more likely to have a third child. So that basically gives an experiment for having child number 3. Now, one of my colleagues, whose name I shall not mention, at one point described this paper as an example of one of these economics papers that provides a perfect answer to a question no one is asking. What is the impact of the third child? Most people have 1 or 2 children, and for those who have more, it's usually game over when the third child arrives. So it's a very neat answer in terms of what it does, but it's very far from being able to answer these big picture questions that I set out at the beginning, which is what is the impact of children on gender inequality overall? There are other instruments out there, such as using IVF treatment success, that works, again, really well in terms of what it does, but is, at the end of the day, somewhat limited in the ability to answer the big picture questions I set out. So in a nutshell, the problem of these strategies is external validity and statistical power. So I'm going to try and do something different, which is simpler, and I think turns out to work really well. Okay. So another difference between what I'm going to do today and these earlier papers is that my agenda really is much broader, as I kind of already suggested. I'm really interested in estimating the full impact of children in the entire population, and then link that to aggregate gender inequality. A third difference, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about today and even more so tomorrow, is that ultimately I really want to try and build a global data set of how these effects work. Really sort of, in some sense, draw a world map of child penalties, and I'm going to show you some of that today. And finally, the question of why are these child penalties there? Why do they always fall on women? Now, I'm going to weave together evidence from a lot of different projects. Some projects that are already complete that I've done in the last 5-6 years, along with a lot of ongoing projects. And because I'm going to weave these things together organically, it's not always going to be practical for me to give as much credit as I would like to the various co-authors on these different projects. So I wanted to say from the outset here is that to the extent that you find any of this interesting, it's important that you don't give me the full credit. There are some very important people that have been part of this research program and that have been contributed to it. First and foremost, the agenda was launched 6-7 years ago, together with Camille Landais at the London School of Economics and your very own Jakob Søgaard, who sits over here at Copenhagen. It really all started with a paper we did, which then led to many other projects. A number of other people have joined since on specific aspects of this research program. Okay, so let me start with the very first paper written with Jakob and Camille and talk a little bit about how we are estimating the child penalty and what the results were. So I'm going to really stay away from technical details today and only try and convey the basic ideas. The basic idea of what we did was incredibly simple. So we took an event study approach to estimating the impact of children. So the idea there, as certainly as the economist in the room will know, is to really look for sharp changes in outcome around the event of having a child. So from here on, I'm going to measure time relative to the time of the birth of the first child. So I'm going to refer to this as event time, and year 0 is the year in which you have your first child. So from now on, when I say year 0, I'm not talking about the birth of Jesus Christ. I'm talking about the birth of your child. 2, the birth of every child. And so then I'm going to present you a bunch of graphs that are constructed in a very similar way. I'm going to plot outcomes for men and women separately over event time around the event of the first childbirth. One technical detail, if you will, is that as event time goes, that is, as child becomes older, calendar time also goes, and the parents become older. That means that calendar time is changing and age is changing. And we know from a big literature in labor economics is that these things can have their own impacts on outcomes. And we'd like to take that out in order to isolate the impact of having a child. And so without sort of describing in much detail how we do that, just remember that that's something we think about and we control in a very flexible way for these time trends and life cycle trends or age trends by gender. Okay, so in the very first paper we wrote, we focused on Denmark, which is appropriate since we're in Denmark. And so let's see how things look in Denmark. So this is the very first graph. So this graph shows impacts on earnings, so full annual earnings. So on the x-axis here, you have event time. So we start time 5 years before people have their first child, and we end event time 10 years after people have their first child. The y-axis shows earnings. Everything is measured relative to event time -1. That is the year before you have your first child. Women are in black, men are in gray. One more thing on the x-axis here is that everything here is presented within percentages. So when you look at these dots here, so you can think of each dot for men and women as the impact of having children at that event time relative to the year before, measured in percentages. So for example, when, see this one anyway, but when the number is say minus 0.3, that is a drop of 30% in earnings. Now, so what does this graph show? Well, it's kind of self-explanatory. Men and women essentially evolved in parallel prior to having their first child. Then the first child comes, and that's essentially, in terms of labor market outcomes, a non-event for fathers. For women, on the other hand, there is a very large, very sharp drop in the earnings, and that drop is very persistent over time. Women never come back. They never catch up with men subsequently. On the slide here, do you see it? Okay, I don't see the laser. I don't know if you see it. Is it there? Maybe it's, oh, it is there. Okay, well, need my glasses, okay. So on the graph there, you also have the long run child penalty. So again, the child penalty, that is the impact of children on women relative to men, and this is the long run child penalty, so at the very end of the graph. And so you can see for Denmark, impact of having children on women relative to men is an earnings effect of minus 20%. So that's the child penalty. Now, you can extend this to an even longer run, and the thing is, things are incredibly persistent over time. This 20% effect lasts even 20 years out after having had the first child. Okay, so earnings is, of course, a very broad outcome, and there are a lot of different underlying effects that can go into creating an earnings effect. At a mechanical level, an earnings response can come from either labor supply or wage rates, and labor supply can either be hours worked for those who are working, or it can be the margin of working or not, the employment margin. So we can split this earnings effect, this earnings penalty, into these three underlying margins. That's what we do on this graph here, where I repeat the earnings event study in the upper left, and then you have the three underlying components in the three other panels: hours worked, employment, and wage rates among those who are working. And so what you can see is that this child penalty in earnings, it doesn't come from one specific mechanism. It comes from all these different margins at the same time. There are sharp effects on all of them. And it happens that in Denmark, the child penalty in each is about the same. So roughly speaking, the earnings penalty is driven in roughly equal proportions by hours worked, employment, and wage rates. Now you can go a step deeper than that and think about what are the underlying behaviors that are associated with changes in labor supply and wage rates, by looking at what happens to the occupations of women relative to men, what happens to the firms in which they're working, promotions, sectors, and so on. And we do that in the paper as well, and these things are also responding, although I'm not going to show you that here. Okay, so that's in a nutshell some of the key evidence we had in the first paper. Now, the neat thing is that we're estimating these child penalties in the full population, and in principle, these child penalties include the full impact of children for families, and that makes it relatively straightforward to ask the question, well, what are the implications of these child penalties of gender inequality in earnings? Like, how much of the gender inequality that we observe in Denmark can they account for, and how has this been changing over time? And so this graph here shows that the composition, so focus on the left graph first, where the blue part is the part of gender inequality in earnings explained by child penalties, and the gray part is all the rest of it, whatever it is. And as you can see that over time, child penalties account for more and more of gender inequality. It can account for about 40% in the beginning of this period and about 80% at the end of the period. In other words, today in Denmark, eliminating gender inequality in earnings is almost synonymous with eliminating the child penalty. You may then want to ask, what goes into the gray area? Well, everything else goes into the gray area. One thing we can think about, and that people have thought a lot about, are differences in education between men and women. And I have that on the other panel over here, where you can see that the impact of education, the orange bit there, explains some of gender inequality as well, but less and less over time. I'm going to come back to the implications of education later in this talk. But the impact today of education differences is very small compared to the impact of child penalty. Okay, so briefly, let me just return to sort of the methodological question that we started out with, which is, do we believe these child penalties are causal? The short answer is yes, we believe they are. In order to think about that, we really want to distinguish a little bit about the short run effects that are happening right around childbirth and the longer run effects. The short run effects, I think, are relatively well identified because they really rely on a smoothness assumption. It's really that incredibly sharp change that's happening just after having kids, but not before, that makes us believe that this is really a cost impact of having kids. The long run penalties are harder to estimate, and there, in what I've done implicitly, I'm really relying on a kind of assumption that if not for the treatment impact of kids, men and women would have evolved on parallel trends. That is, they would have evolved in parallel trends, conditional on having taken these time trends effects out and the life cycle effects. Now, that sounds like a much stronger assumption. Now, we thought quite a lot about that in our paper and tried to validate that assumption using other approaches. And I'm not going to go into that, but the bottom line is that you can actually validate even these long run effects using other approaches, which makes us believe that these are truly causal effects. Okay, so that's the basic evidence in Denmark. Now, so of course, being Danish, I am aware that, in Scandinavia, we like to think that we're on the forefront of all things good in the world. And so it's a little disconcerting maybe to see these big child penalties in a country like Denmark. And so maybe a natural question arises is, are things worse in Denmark than in other countries? Or how do we compare to other countries? And that's what I'm going to do now. And let me calm you down from the outset by saying, don't worry, things are even worse elsewhere. We're doing good. We're doing good. So geographical variation. Let's think about some variation across countries. So the first graph here compares earnings penalties in Denmark. That's the blue graph up there. That's the one I've just shown you. To earnings penalties in Sweden in red. And Sweden is actually, let me just note that Sweden is a little bit unusual, is that it's actually the only country that I've ever seen evidence for, that I've done evidence for, where there is a little bit of a dip for men after the event of having a child. It's relatively small. It's much smaller than it is for men, but there is a dip. Still, the divergence between men and women in Sweden, a country with which Denmark is relatively comparable, that divergence in Sweden is even larger. So the long run penalty in Sweden in earnings is 26%, as opposed to here, 21% for Denmark. What about English-speaking countries like the UK and the US? So we have those here. Well, in English-speaking countries, the child penalties are considerably larger. The qualitative pattern is very similar, right? Men and women evolve in parallel until the first child comes along, and then there's this sharp divergence between men and women just after, and that sharp divergence is very persistent. Women never catch up with men subsequently. But the child penalties are just larger, 53% in the UK and 34% in the United States. Then what about if we move to German-speaking countries? So this graph here shows Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. And now the effects are even larger, absolutely staggering, in fact. The short run penalty in these Germanic countries is between 60 and 90%. And the long run penalties are between around 50 and almost 70%. So Switzerland takes the prize here with a long run earnings penalty of 68%. So that means even within this really narrow set of high income countries, 7 countries, there is a huge amount of variation in child penalty, from about 20% in Denmark on the one hand to almost 70% in Switzerland on the other hand. And of course, the intriguing question is, why are things so different? One possible explanation that I'm going to come back to several times in these lectures is the idea that it has something to do with gender norms and culture. So what is also true of these countries is that you ask people, there are very different norms or very different beliefs about gender in this country. So this next graph here tries to get at that question. So it plots these child penalty values that I've shown you, the long run penalty, against one particular component of gender beliefs, namely the answer in different countries to the question of, do you think that women with young children, and young children here means children at preschool age or at school age, do you believe that women with young children should not work full time? Rather, do you agree with the statement that women with young children should not work full time, but rather stay at home with their children? And as you can see here, there are very big differences to the fraction of populations that agree with this statement. About 50% in Denmark agree with that. More than 90% in Switzerland think that women should stay at home with the children when the children are still young. And that just correlates beautifully with these child penalties. It's a correlation, not necessarily causality, but it's certainly a striking one. Now, in terms of thinking about these beliefs about gender, I think one point which I think is worth pointing out is, in terms of interpreting this, is that men and women tend to share these gender beliefs. This is not a matter of men having one view and women having a different view. So on this slide here, you can see 4 different measures of gender beliefs. The top left one is the one that I started out with. So do you agree with the fact that women with young children should not be working full time? Then there's one that says preschool, do you agree with the fact that preschool children will suffer if their mother works? Working mother cannot have a warm relationship with children. Men should work, women should stay at home. So these are 4 different ones. In all of these graphs, what I'm plotting is the fraction of women agreeing on the y-axis and the fraction of men agreeing with this on the x-axis. And the line in each panel is the 45-degree line. And if men and women agree, every country will be on the 45-degree line. And you see what's striking is that that is pretty much true on all of these different questions. Men and women agree. Countries are tightly clustered around the 45-degree line. That's consistent with the social norm or culture interpretation. That is, whatever it is that people believe, it's something that has been internalized and that both gender agree with. If there was a disagreement with men and women, we would have to think about different types of stories. Okay, so far so good. So these were 7 countries, a very strong correlation with gender beliefs. Now, what I think is equally striking is that there's even a ton of variation in these penalties within much smaller geographical areas, namely within country. So I'm going to give you a few examples of that. So the first one is the contrast between East and West Germany. So as you know, Germany was separated between 1945 and 1990. And during this period, East and West Germany pursued very different gender models. So East Germany pursued a sort of a dual earner state career model where women were strongly encouraged to participate in the labor market, while West Germany pursued a more traditional homemaker breadwinner model. And during this period, there was a big divergence between these 2 parts of Germany in terms of both labor supply and gender beliefs. And then, of course, in 1990, these 2 very different cultural systems were thrown back together into one system, now with the same political, legal, and economic system. And what's interesting to see what happened with child penalties, what are child penalties looking like today in East and West Germany 30 years after reunification. This graph shows this. So the red ones are the impact of children in East Germany, and the blue one is the impact of children on men and women in West Germany. And so what you can see in this graph is that the short run effects right around childbirth, that's about the same. But over time, women in East Germany come back and increase their earnings. And so in the long run, there is a very large difference between the impact on East German women and West German women. The child penalty in East Germany is about 34%. In West Germany, it's essentially twice as large, 67%. So again, it's just cross-sectional comparison between two regions here, but it's certainly very correlated with something having to do with culture and gender beliefs. I should also mention that this graph here has a special place in these lectures because I think it's the only one that I'm going to show which is not my own. So I need to give due credit here to a set of authors who were very kindly gave me the data to reproduce this graph, namely Dominic Sachs and a set of co-authors have produced the estimates that underlie this graph here. So that's Germany. Another conservative country overall that feature quite a bit of within-country heterogeneity is Switzerland, and I'm going to come back to Switzerland several times today. Now, one simple part of Switzerland that's interesting is into the French-speaking part of Switzerland and the German-speaking part of Switzerland. The French-speaking part of Switzerland is a more gender-progressive part of the country. German-speaking part is a more conservative part, and consistent with that, you can see that child penalties are considerably larger in the German-speaking part of the country. And the final example of within-country variation I want to give you is based on the US. And I'm just giving you a few examples here of 4 different states in the US. As you say here, I'm looking at impacts on labor supply or employment rather than on earnings. So here I'm showing 4 more or less random states, not quite random, but only 4 states: North Dakota, Washington, DC, California, and Utah. I'm going to see there, again, within a country like US, massive differences. North Dakota has a very small employment penalty, about 19%. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have Utah, which is a massive employment penalty of about 37%. Remember that 37% is a really big impact on employment because employment is just one component of the overall earnings penalty. So it's should be a small effect in general, or it is a small effect on the earnings penalty. And still it's 37% in Utah. Again, this seems to be correlated with things we know about culture. Of course, Utah is a religiously very conservative state in the US. Okay, so this is some variation within states. Now, let's go in the other direction. Instead of sort of zooming in on very small geographic areas, let's take a bird's eye view and look at what happens in the whole world. So what I'm in the process of doing jointly with Camille Landé, and I'm going to talk more about how we do that tomorrow, sort of talk a little bit about the methodology that goes into this. But today I'm just going to kind of claim that I'm going to show you things that are true and perfect, and we're just going to look at the results and be very interested in them. So we're trying to build a global database of child penalties. Now, let me say a little bit about what we need for that. So the strength of this event study approach that I've shown you so far is that, for these countries that we've done, is that it relies on having really good panel data. In other words, you have very large data sets where you observe both men and women repeatedly over time. Conditional on having great administrative panel data, as we have for Denmark and some other countries, it's very simple to implement this approach. But the limitation of the approach is that's a big ask. That's a data requirement that's not met in a ton of countries. So if we stick with that approach, we can only provide evidence for so many countries. So I was interested in coming up with an approach that is similar, that we can validate against that panel data approach that allows us to broaden this out a lot more. And so essentially the evidence I'm now going to present to you is not based on panel data, it's based on repeated cross-sections where we observe different men and women over time. and then using repeated cross-sectional data to develop essentially a pseudo event study approach. It's going to look like event studies, what I'm going to show you, but it's not, in some sense, a real event study because you're not observing the same people before having children and after having children. Now, there's a lot of thinking and methodology that goes into that I will talk a bit about tomorrow. But in a nutshell, the approach really works. You can really do this. And the great thing about that is that cross-sectional data is something we have from a very wide set of countries, even pretty good cross-sectional data. So now we can begin to really look at this in many different places. So let me give you a few examples. So this one here shows child penalties on employment in different countries. And again, sort of just selecting some different ones that bring out some of the intriguing variations. So here, we have a very eclectic set of countries. We have Argentina, we have Bangladesh, we have China, we have Jordan, we have Russia, we have South Africa. And you can see, well, again, the qualitative patterns are, again, repeats themselves everywhere, right? The men and women involved similarly before having kids, then they diverge, women never come back, maybe with one exception up there. So that's true everywhere, but the magnitudes of these child penalties are very different. So for example, in Bangladesh up here, the child penalty on employment is 59%. That's absolutely staggering. Remember, Switzerland was 68%, but that was in earnings, not in employment. A 60% child penalty in employment is very, very big. So that's on the one extreme. Then we have another country up there, which is an outlier in the other direction. That's China. China is one of the few countries in the world where there's hardly any child penalty. There is a little bit, it's 3%. You can see there is that tiny little divergence between men and women. So it's there qualitatively, but it's very, very small. You can also see in Russia there is a clear child penalty, but again, it's relatively small. So it seems that there is a pattern here when you combine this with the evidence I showed you for East Germany, that current or former socialist countries pursue different models and generally have much smaller child penalties than we see in capitalist countries. Another thing to highlight up there is Jordan, which has a very big child penalty. That's a Middle Eastern, that's a Muslim country. Argentina has a very big child penalty. That's generally true of Latin America. South Africa has a somewhat smaller child penalty, and that is generally true of Africa, that we see much smaller penalties there. Now, the neat thing about doing this with cross-sectional data is that not only we have such data for many countries, but we typically have really big data sets. And that allows us to really dig into even within country variation, because we just have a lot of data. We have a lot of statistical power. So what we can even do is to look at how these child penalties varies in different cities or in different provinces of different countries. So here you see just set up an eclectic set of nine cities. So for example, what do you see in China? We have almost no child penalty overall, but that masks some interesting heterogeneity. In Beijing, for example, there is a sizable child penalty of 14%. But then at the other extreme, you have Shanghai over here, where there's absolutely nothing. It's one of the few places in the world where there's just nothing is happening. Having a child is a non-event for both men and women. You have Dhaka in Bangladesh, which has an even higher child penalty than Bangladesh overall, more than 60%. You have massive child penalties in places like Istanbul, but much smaller child penalties, for example, in an African city like Nairobi here. So just a ton of variation, which is just very interesting to think about, but this is not, of course, not a structural parameter. There's something going on here. Instead of going down to the city level, we can go the other way and just summarize the total child penalty across countries in different continents of the world. So here we have the 6 different continents: Europe, North America, Latin America, Oceania, Asia, and Africa. And you can see on average, Europe, North America, and Oceania, so that's Australia and all the islands around it, they're about the same. Although we know that there's a lot of heterogeneity underneath that. Latin America has larger child penalties, whereas Asia and Africa much lower. Of course, Asia, do remember that, these are population-weighted continent event studies. So of course, China is a big part of Asia. So China really pulls Asia down. There are other parts of Asia, such as countries in the Middle East, that have much bigger child penalties. Africa, in particular, has almost no child penalty. Okay, so ultimately I can do this kind of thing to really draw a world atlas of child penalty across all countries and different places within countries, and that's kind of what I'm going to really work on tomorrow, or talk about in the lecture tomorrow. Today I kind of want to move on and think a little bit about, what might the explanations be for all of this variation that we're seeing. All right, so what might explain these child penalties? So on this slide here, I provided sort of my own little sort of what I think is sort of a taxonomy of possible explanations that could underlie these child penalties. Some of the different hypotheses that are out there that people have thought about. And I think, in general, explanations fall within the 6 categories that I've listed up here. The first category is based on the simple idea that men and women are different. We do different things. We like different things. And that's why we're seeing these child penalties. So in other words, the idea that this is something that's biologically rooted. Now, there are 2 versions of the biology hypothesis. One is about basically hardwired brain differences between men and women. And another one is more specifically about birth-related differences between men and women. So the hypothesis about hardwired biological differences is based on the idea of what's sometimes called the empathizing brain and the system-building brain. This is the idea that some psychologists and others have argued for, that female brains are built for empathy and caretaking, and men's brains are more conducive to understanding and building systems. Now, these things are in some sense very difficult to analyze, because it's something, how do we get variation in it? It's a statement about this is just how it is. There's no variation. At the same time, we'll say that I do not find this explanation compelling in this context at all. I think a very basic argument against hardwired biological differences, an explanation here, is simply the enormous variation I've shown you. These things vary hugely across different countries and across different cities or regions within countries. And in some places, there really is hardly any child penalty. In other places, it's very big. If this was driven by hardwired biological differences, that's not the pattern we would expect to see. A slightly narrower version of the biological hypothesis is the one that there are birth-related biological differences. Well, we know that there are birth-related biological differences. That's the one thing we know. So only women can bear children, only women can deliver children, and only women can breastfeed children. So that's the biological difference that's clear. What we will certainly expect that this gives women a comparative advantage in infant childcare. That's almost a given. And so some of the short-run differences, some of the short-run child penalties that we're seeing, we would expect that that's part of these birth-related biological aspects. But I think the more interesting question is, do these birth-related biological differences carry over to the long-run effects as well? And that's possible in theory, and there are 2 main reasons why. One is that the physiological effects of pregnancy and birth and breastfeeding may last, partly because of postpartum health complications, and partly because, and this is again something that there are papers about, partly because maybe pregnancy and birth changes hormonal levels as well as brain structure in a way that's conducive to taking care of children as opposed to pursuing a career. And the other reason why birth-related biological factors may last, may be persistent in the long run, is simply because of labor market dynamics. There is a comparative advantages in infant childcare. Women interrupt work, and there are dynamic effects in the labor market, experience effects, human capital, and such. Then these effects may carry over into the long run. Now, how would we want to investigate this hypothesis? Well, we did that again with Jakob and Camille. What's key to investigate this hypothesis is we want to separate having a child and giving birth to a child. And the natural way to do that is to compare biological families with adoptive families. Adoptive families, they have kids while skipping that whole pregnancy, delivery, and breastfeeding stage. And so let's think about, how do these child penalty look in these two types of families? And we did that in a paper, and the evidence looks like this. So here you have women in red, men in blue. Biological families are dashed, adoptive families are solid. Again, you can see having a child is a non-event for men. That's true in both biological families and in families who adopt. That's not true for women. We see sharp and persistent effects in both types of families. And the striking thing is that in the long run, they're exactly the same. There's a little bit of a difference in the short run here. So the child penalty, the short run child penalty is bigger in biological families, most likely reflecting breastfeeding and giving birth. But that small difference dissipates over time, and in the long run, the two families evolve in the same way. And so I think we presented more evidence related to this, but I think this is enough to show here. I think that's really an indication that the birth-related biological factors do not just seem to be a compelling route to explain the long-run child penalties. At best, it's an explanation for short-run effects, but even there, it seems to be accounting for relatively little. Now, so that's one relatively traditional explanation, which I don't find so compelling. Another traditional explanation that we love in economics is, of course, comparative advantage. So what's clear is that specialization is generally efficient. So kind of it does make sense that one person pursue a career and the other person takes care of children. That's not really the question here. The question is, why is it so gendered? Why is it always one who does the career stuff and the other one who does the kid stuff? And so the comparative advantage story would be one that women simply have a comparative advantage in caretaking and men have a comparative advantage in working and building a career. And so let's think a little bit about that too. So the natural place to start for thinking about this hypothesis is to look at, I think, education differences between men and women. Let me show you something on that. So here you have two panels. The left panel focuses on differences between men and women in the quantity of education, and the right panel focuses on differences between men and women in the type of education. So look at the left one first. So that's simply the fraction of people with a higher education degree. So, basically any kind of tertiary education, college and above. And it plots the fraction of women with such education against the fraction of men. And so what you can see here is that in virtually every single country in the world, these dots, not in virtually, in every single country I have here, which are all OECD countries, we're above the 45-degree line. In other words, in every country in OECD, women are more educated than men. That in itself goes very strongly against, of course, the comparative advantage story. However, there could still be a comparative advantage story because even though women are more educated, they take different types of education. And in particular, they take types of education that don't pay as well. So that's the right panel, which shows the fraction with a STEM degree. So any kind of degree related to science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. And now you can see every country is below the 45-degree line. So many more men take these types of education, whereas women tend to go more into the humanities. And STEM fields pay better. So that potentially gives men a comparative advantage in market work, even though they're less educated in terms of quantity. So we looked at that in the paper with Jakob as well. And so what we did is we used this sort of the quantity of education on the left, as well as the education field on the right. So both how much education do you have and what type of education you have. We use that together with labor market experience to predict for each family the earnings potential of women and men within different families, and ask, do we see a difference in child penalty in families where women actually have a bigger earnings potential, given their education degree, given their field, given their labor experience, compared to men, compared to the families where women have less of an earnings potential compared to their right? So if there is comparative advantage story here, what we'd expect to see is that women that have bigger earnings potential than their men should also have lower child penalties, or in fact, the men should pay the child penalties. What do you see? You see absolutely none of that. You see none of this comparative advantage story. So the left graph compare families in the top versus bottom half of the relative female earnings capacity distribution, and the right panel compare families in the top and bottom quartile of that distribution. So in each one, the blue one are women with relatively low earnings capacity compared to the men. The red one are women with high earnings capacity compared to their men. And you can see these families make the same kind of choices. Even women who have a higher earnings capacity than men, they're still the one who takes care of the children while the men pursue their career. This is just one country, but the evidence I've seen from different countries generally suggests that comparative advantages is not the main reason we're observing what we're observing here. Then there's a third component. How am I doing the time? Oh, it's up there. All right, very good. So then there's a whole third component related to government intervention. So certainly a lot of the public debate, a lot of the political debate on gender inequality focuses a lot on the design of various public policies and their ability to impact gender inequality, to solve the problem of gender inequality. I'm going to largely skip that today simply because the third of my lectures is completely devoted to the impact of public policies. That's one of the areas where we have the most evidence, because we know as economists how to analyze public policies. There are so many of them. They have so much interesting variation that allows us to really estimate in a very convincing way causal effects of policies. There are two main policies that people have thought about in the context of this. One is parental leave schemes and how they're designed, and the other one is childcare provision and how much of that the government provides. And those are really the two natural ones to think about once we realize that gender inequality is mostly about child penalties, because these are really family policies that directly impact the opportunities and incentives surrounding childcare. So to see a lot of detailed evidence on that, you're going to have to wait till lecture 3. But let me just say, bottom line, policies overall, I would say, have a surprisingly small impact on these things. Sometimes people find effects, sometimes not. But even when the effects are there, they're relatively small. Policy, I would say, is neither the culprit nor, as far as I've seen so far, the solution here. It's just not, it's not the main story. The only policy that I think does have an effect is the one on my list up there, which is maybe the least surprising, which is welfare programs. Initially, when I started thinking about these things, I didn't really think about welfare programs as a very natural policy to consider, because it doesn't really seem very closely related to child penalties. But welfare programs are very important, especially in what we observe for single mothers. And that's the one policy I think has a really large impact. Maybe I will show you one graph here because I find it very striking. It's not going to be conclusive in and of itself, but it's going to be intriguing and give some food for thought. At this graph here, this graph compares the United States and Denmark. So as you know, we've already seen that the United States has overall much larger child penalties than Denmark. So these here are employment penalties, where Denmark has an average penalty for the entire population of, if I remember correctly, 13%, whereas the US is more like 23 or 24% on average. So the US penalty is about twice as large for them. But then when you split it into the child penalty on married women, single women, the thing really flips. So the child penalty for married women in the US is much larger than the child penalty for married women in the US, but the child penalty for single women in the US is way, way smaller than the child penalty for single women in Denmark. The single women in Denmark have a much bigger child penalty than married women, which makes sense if you think, well, you know, it's more of a struggle to be a single mom than to be a married mom. So it makes sense in some sense that there is a bigger child penalty, but we don't see that in the US. And the question is why? And I think, and I'm going to show you some evidence in a couple of days, that this is really because of the welfare system, because someone has to pay for children. If you're a single mom, you have to pay for children. And that means that the only way in which you can't work and have children is that the welfare system needs to pay for your children. So without a welfare system, you're really forced to work. That's what we're seeing in the US, because the US has a very, very ungenerous welfare system compared to Denmark. So in some sense, you can think of this, I think, as an income effect of welfare benefits. That's sort of an effect of policy for a specific segment, but it's a large effect. Okay, back to the high level explanations. So 1, 2, 3, some effects, but I don't think this is where the main story lies. Then we have explanation number 4, employer discrimination. This is the one I'm going to largely skip. We have some evidence on discrimination. Again, bottom line there, I think some of the best evidence we have on discrimination, which comes from, obviously some of the best evidence come from resume audit studies, not stuff I've done, but there are some really good papers on that. Fail to find evidence of any large direct employer discrimination. So that really leaves me with number 4 and number 5 there. The bottom line is I think number 4 and number 5 are both very important. One has to do with gender norms and culture, which I have already talked about. And another one, which is much harder to analyze, is what I've called general equilibrium here. Different countries, different areas are just in different general equilibria, and these things probably affect child penalties quite a bit. There are a number of different aspects of that, but I've just highlighted 2 up there. The first one is about childcare. So we talked about the public provision of childcare not having a massive impact. I think that is partly related to how public provision of childcare reflects to other forms of childcare, informal childcare and privately provided childcare. So countries vary with respect to which there is a family network, relatives, grandparents, the village, the broader social network that helps with taking care of children. And countries vary with respect to the market for private childcare. That's one aspect. And I think that's relevant for maybe thinking about the global variation in child penalties. For example, Africa versus Europe. The other one is also relevant for that. That has to do with job flexibility. And there's sort of 2 aspects of that. One is sort of the family friendliness of jobs. That's something that people like Claudia Golden and others have thought a lot about in recent years, that, it's just kind of pretty clear idea that it really matters the degree to which different firms, different types of jobs offer flexibility for families. And there are big differences in that across jobs. So for example, being a partner in a law firm in Manhattan offers a lot less flexibility than working on a farm in North Dakota. There's 2 very different jobs. A famous sector in the US that offers quite a bit of family friendliness is the pharmaceutical profession in the US. Now, but once you say family friendliness, that naturally points to maybe the bigger and more long run aspect, which is just industrial composition. And I kind of highlighted that by the example of working on a farm in North Dakota, which has to do with the fraction of agriculture, the fraction of people who are self-employed, and so on. And these things, these different industries come with very different degrees of flexibility, and we would think that that impacts child penalties. So that's something I'm going to talk a bit more about tomorrow, actually. Today, I kind of want to use the rest of the time to think a little bit more about these gender norms and culture, trying to go a little bit deeper than the simple correlations that I've shown you so far. So I'm going to return to Switzerland because I think Switzerland is a really interesting country to think about in this particular context. So as I've highlighted, Switzerland is a very gender conservative place. You can see that in the context of some of these gender beliefs that I've mentioned. 91% believe that women with young children should not be working full time. If you go back to the cross-country correlation I showed you earlier, just remember that Switzerland here was the outlier. Similarly, in Switzerland, about half of everyone believe that a preschool child will suffer if the mother has a job. Now, I think an even more striking way to look at gender beliefs in Switzerland is to think about women's suffrage. So Switzerland was one of the last countries in the developed world to introduce women's right to vote. So women got the right to vote at the federal level in Switzerland in 1971. Then you have the canton level in Switzerland, which makes their own decisions about women's suffrage. And the latest canton in Switzerland to give women the right to vote was in 1990, which is really quite stunning when you think about it. So this is the gender conservative setting. Now, sort of building on that in this new project with Anna Hotz and Camille Ondet and Andrea Steinhauer and Josef Zweimüller, we use spatial variation in these votes on women's suffrage to create a different measure of gender norms. So we're going to measure the gender progressivity of a place with a fraction who voted yes to women's suffrage in the 1971 federal election. The reason why that's useful is that there's an enormous amount of variation in that. Different places are really very different. So this is a heat map of yes votes to women's suffrage in 1971 in Switzerland. So here, darker red means more people voted yes. Lighter color means that less people voted yes. As you can see that there's a ton of variation here. The lightest color, less than 30% voted yes to giving women the right to vote in 1971. In the darkest red colors, about 90% voted yes. The black line here, that's the French-German language border. So again, you can see a very striking correlation here between French-speaking and German-speaking. Now, does this correlate with child penalties? Absolutely. So let me show you a heat map of child penalties in Switzerland. So earnings child penalties on the left, employment child penalties on the right. And you can see that's essentially the reverse. The places that are light on voting yes to women's suffrage are very dark here, and vice versa. And again, of course, there's this very clear distinction between French-speaking and German-speaking. So putting this variation into one bin scatter plot, it looks like this. So the left graph here is the child penalty against the fraction voting yes in different parts of the distribution. I'm still struggling with this laser. It's really hard to see from my angle. And the employment penalty over here does that same thing for the employment penalty. And you can just see there's a very, very clear relationship here with a really big slope. Now, this again is still, it's a correlation. It's now a lot more granular than what I showed you before, but it's still a correlation between some measure of social norms in different places and child penalties. What is the concern for making a causal interpretation of this? Well, it's the usual concern that we obsess about in economics, namely selection. So we're worried that people living in more or less conservative places are different, and they're different in ways that impact their child penalty. So we want to come up with a slightly more compelling approach. I'm going to present you one example of this, but it's still work in progress, where we sort of keep trying to push on how far we can go in this. But where we start is to take what we typically call an epidemiological approach to culture. So the epidemiological approach, as some of you may know, is of course it's a term that comes from medicine. And in medicine, it's used to distinguish the genetic and the environmental impact on specific disease. In economics, the epidemiological approach is used to separate the impact of culture from the impact of other aspects of the environment. And the basic idea is very simple. The idea is to try and identify the effect of culture by comparing individuals who live in the same environment, the same political, legal, and economic environment, but originating from an environment that has different social beliefs or different cultures. The typical focus in this literature has been to look at immigrants or their descendants in a certain country, in a certain host country, coming from different source countries. So we're going to take this kind of approach. It's not an approach that comes without its concerns. So we're going to try and, or partly because of that, we're going to try and innovate a little bit on the epidemiological approach to see if we can come up with something that's convincing. So we innovate in 3 different ways. One is granularity. Normally, what this approach does is to look at, for example, immigrants or first or second generation immigrants in the US coming from different countries around the world, which means that you're essentially comparing Indian immigrants, Syrian immigrants, French and Danish immigrants. And the concern here is, again, a very big selection concern because these types of immigrants are very different. So here we're going to go much more granular and really looking at moves within different municipalities in Switzerland. The second one is we're going to look at place effects in 2 ways. That is, we're going to try and see if we can find an effect of where you're born holding constant where you live now. In other words, childhood environment. And the other one is we're going to try and go the other way to look at an impact of where you live now, conditional on where you were born. That's your adult environment. Both your childhood culture may have an impact and the culture of the people around you now may have an impact. And of course, the third aspect of what we're doing here is that we're looking at a completely different outcome, child penalties, than people have looked at in this literature. And we're looking at this new norms measure having to do with women's suffrage. Okay, so what do we find? Well, first of all, so this is the effect of place of residence. So the culture around you now. And so what we do is at a very granular level, we estimate child penalties, and then we plot them against the vote share in the 1971 referendum in your municipality. The key thing is when you change where you live now, that's likely correlated with where you were born, right? So people who live in conservative places now, say somewhere in the Alps, they were likely born there too. And similarly, people who live in a relatively progressive French-speaking area in the west of Switzerland likely lived in an area like that. So what we're doing here is we're trying to get around that by holding your birthplace constant. We're going to focus only on movers. We're then holding your birthplace constant, very conservative, very progressive, whatever it is. And then we look at the impact of then moving to different places that are more or less progressive. So it's kind of not quite a mover's design, but we're getting there. It's a little closer. So what you can see here is that as the vote share, that is the share of people voting yes, in the municipality in which you live, as that becomes higher, child penalties are falling. The impact, I think, is relatively large. You know, in the most conservative areas, the penalty is close to 40%, and in the most progressive areas, it's sort of like 32, 33%, so a fall of 7 percentage point or so across the distribution of these vote shares. You can do the reverse thing with the impact of birthplace, and that is what I have here. So now it's the reverse thing. It's like we hold constant where you live now, and then we look at coming from different places that are more or less progressive. And you can see that has an impact too, and it's in fact almost the same magnitude. So these graphs here are consistent with an effect of culture, both the culture in which you grew up and the culture in which you live now, in terms of gender norms. And you sort of add up these 2 effects, it would potentially account for a really sizable fraction of the variation in child penalties across these different areas of Switzerland. Now, we're not quite there. There's still a concern here, which is we sort of moved the selection concern to the next level. Here we're worried about people moving, selected moves, essentially. And so what we're pushing towards now is to go to sort of a real movers design, where we're really looking at the very specific timing of your move, and through that get variation in the exact exposure you have to different environments. But at least the findings we have here are consistent with the impact of culture. Do I have any time left? Have
10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes.
Maybe 15 to start with.
Okay. I do want to say this thing here because it's an actual question. Why do we care about these child penalties? Is it is it also a happiness penalty? So when women pay these big labor market costs that men don't pay, does it impact their life satisfaction? So I thought I wanted to discuss that a little bit. That question has a very simple answer, which is no. The child penalty is not a life satisfaction penalty. So this graph here is really constructed in the exact same way as all the other graphs I presented you, except the outcome is life satisfaction for men and women. And so what you can see in this graph is that essentially there is a little bit of a life satisfaction bubble around having a kid, but you start out in the same place as where you end out, right? So the way I tend to think about this graph is here in the beginning, let me see. So here, man and woman meet, they fall in love, things are pretty, life is good. Out of this happiness and feel good, they produce a baby. Happiness lasts for a little bit, reality sets in, and they return to the baseline level of misery over time. But the bottom line is that there is no long run penalty. They're not any worse off in the end than they were in the beginning. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't be interested in child penalties? No, I don't think it does. And in fact, I don't even think it's terribly surprising that there is no life satisfaction penalty. I think basically there are three types of reasons for this pattern. The first one is related to the concept of adaptation, which is a well-known idea among people working on life satisfaction. It's the idea that people tend to adapt to life events, positive and negative, over time, and kind of revert whatever happens in life. People tend to revert to their baseline over time. There are a number of studies showing this. So whether it's the impact of marriage, divorce, widowhood, lottery winnings, becoming paraplegic, all of these things have short-term impacts on life satisfaction, positive and negative, depending on the shock, but over time, people tend to revert to the baseline. So that's what's sometimes known as the hedonic treadmill. So that's one possibility why we don't see anything here. There are two other possibilities, and the three possibilities here on this slide are not mutually exclusive. They could all be at play at the same time. The second one is important. It's a very basic point to just remember, which is that there are costs and benefits to having children, as many of us know. Children come with many, many benefits. I've talked a lot about child penalties. Some people object to the term because it suggests that having children is a bad thing. Let me be clear, I don't think that's true. Children have many good things, but the child penalty just focuses on the cost side of having children. It's the opportunity cost in the labor market. But as soon as we look at life satisfaction, then of course we're including the benefits as well. And so if people make good decisions about having children, benefits should outweigh the cost, and we wouldn't really expect to see a penalty. And on top of that, in terms of the absence of any divergence between men and women, well, it may be just like the opportunity cost in the labor market are unequally distributed, the benefits may be unequally distributed too, and partly compensate for the opportunity cost. It's a possibility that the reason why people bear the child penalty in the first place is because they spend more time with their children and they take care of them more. Well, maybe spending more time with them and also imply that you reap more of the benefits. And the third one is this idea that life satisfaction may be a public good within families. I mentioned one of my colleagues earlier. Here's another one of my colleagues at some point, whose name I should also not mention, said to, I remember he used to say, the upper bound on a man's happiness is the happiness of his wife. And all he had to add is the reverse of that, which is that an upper bound of a woman's happiness is the happiness of her husband, in which case you can never diverge. Essentially, happiness is more or less public good within a family, in which case you can't really diverge. So maybe children are bearing the child penalty, but if they're unhappy about it, it's going to ultimately affect the life satisfaction of the husband. So all of these three components can explain why we see no life satisfaction penalty. It's still true that these child penalties are explaining most of the gender inequality that we see in the labor market and I think are important. So My time is up, so to just very quickly summarize, I think the breadwinner homemaker institution, it's very interesting to try and understand it because it really is one of the most universal and stable institutions in human history, certainly since the agricultural revolution. We see these child penalties virtually everywhere. They're large everywhere. There's a ton of variation in them, but they're there. And I think the holy grail question, which is so hard that I've tried to inquire a little bit about here, is whether this is something deeply rooted or something we made up, a social construct. And I'm particularly intrigued by this idea that a ton of it is really driven by cultural norms, not necessarily all of it, but a lot of it is driven by gender beliefs, cultural norms, and so on. And I'm gonna talk even more about this tomorrow for those of you who stick around. That's what I have. Thank you.
We have a little time for a few questions. I will run around with the mic.
Yeah, my name is Katrine Stramme Larsen. I'm from section of epidemiology. I was wondering throughout your talk, have you ever thought about doing this within same-sex families? Maybe I missed it. I do not know how long a period you need data for, but it could be really, really interesting also because you showed that the effect was the same of giving birth or having a child.
Yeah.
So that makes a really nice setup for doing it. Investigate this within, because then you will came across the gender.
The brief answer is yes, I've thought about it. And the reason why I didn't is that someone else had already done it. So there are a couple of papers on same-sex couples and really mainly lesbian couples. And so the finding there is that they respond very differently to having kids. Essentially, the biological mother and co-mother do not diverge in terms of their child penalties in the long run. So in couples where gender doesn't vary, but biology does, there is really no long run difference between the two. So it's exactly consistent with the idea that I gave that I don't think it's birth-related biology. It's another way of asking the question, is this a birth-related biology effect or is it something else? I like, from a research perspective, I like the adoptive versus biological families better because sample sizes without it's a much more common thing, and sample sizes are bigger, and so you have a little bit less of a selected sample. So I like that from a research perspective, but the findings are consistent. But one key difference between lesbian couples and other couples is that the biological mother and the co-mother converge to the same level, but that level is virtually zero. There's a different type of family. That is, there really is no long-run child penalty in those families. Yeah, the thing there is, I think someone has tried to do it. That's very difficult to do because of just lack of power. There's just aren't enough male couples who adopt children. That's it's just hard to do.
Yeah, I'm Zeuthen, and I'm a PhD student at KU. So if I understand correctly, in the graph of happiness, you're actually measuring their happiness level in later years corresponding to a baseline year for each gender separately.
That's correct, yeah.
So if you do it that way, then I suppose that female, they would actually expect their future, after they have a birth, they'll have the penalty. So if they make a decision of having a children, then they probably already expect that, and they still make the decision, which means they're choosing the optimal choice. And it's a very huge selection there. And I guess that happiness graph does not tell us too much about what the real effect of having child penalty.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually done that graph in many different ways to kind of get at that, and it's sort of, I think the cut a long story short, we get the same answer when we don't construct it like that. That would be my short answer. But conceptually, you're right. Yeah, conceptually, you're right. I agree with that.
Hello, I'm Sarah Sander. I'm a postdoc here at KU. I wanted to ask, first of all, thank you for a very nice talk. I was very interested or intrigued by the fact that some countries have basically zero gender gap after the birth of a child, and I was wondering whether the level of employment or earnings is very different between men and women in Africa or in China, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question that I didn't say anything about. Because I kind of decided not to go into that, but that's absolutely critical. That's absolutely critical to think about. So baseline levels are entirely different in Africa. So when we compare, say, Africa, or generally countries at a very low level of development, we have a very different baseline level. And that relates to, I think, one question, which is that what are we really measuring with child penalties? We're sort of measuring the impact of children after having children. But in very traditional societies or in low-income society, it may be that a lot of the impact of children is already completely anticipated. That is, in Africa, women aren't even trying to have a career or take an education to begin with. So it's kind of already built in, and that could be part of the reason. So there are these baseline effects. That's something that we are working on, sort of looking into.
Thank you very much for the great talk. I'm Paolo Falco, an assistant professor here in the Department of Economics. My question is actually related to the last one. I found the contrast between one of your opening slides with the idea that the gender gap goes down with development.
Yeah.
Interesting when compared with the fact that, if anything, the child penalty is the lowest in the countries that are poorest in the world, at least according to your graph.
That's
and I know that that comes from the fact that you're measuring, it's not the same thing. I mean, the child penalty is only one part of the story about earnings, about labor market gaps. But I thought if you could expand a little bit on that, because I did think it was quite interesting.
I agree. So, and it's also consistent with the results I showed you that the child penalty becomes, it just explains more and more of inequality over time. That was just for Denmark, but we've seen something similar for other countries where we have done this. So it seems that gender inequality is large at low levels of development, and less of it can be explained by child penalties, perhaps because of these kind of anticipation effects. One thing that is important, though, to note is that, the graphs, some of the graphs at the beginning were for earnings, and some of the graphs at the end were for employment. And that, I think that's a factor too, that maybe penalties aren't so, or the impacts aren't so big on employment in countries at low levels of development, because they work in agriculture, self-employment, things that are incredibly flexible. And so maybe they actually aren't experiencing such big negative impacts on employment.
Hello, I'm Niels Johansen from the University of Copenhagen. So I thought these results for American single mothers were super interesting, and maybe they suggest that like the child penalty is not kind of a way of measuring how well we as a society treat women. That you can really, I mean, that it's probably very hard to be a single American woman, although there's no child penalty, and they might wish to live in Denmark where they are allowed to, but the state would help them support their children without like having two jobs.
Absolutely. So that's an important point. So the fact that single mothers pay smaller child penalties in the US because they don't have a welfare system is not an argument for other countries to abolish the welfare system so we can reduce child penalties. That is critical. Single mothers would be worse off if we did that. So those graphs are more just, that's kind of about understanding why the child penalty is there. But child penalty doesn't measure welfare. It's very tricky to think about how to go from child penalties to welfare. They're interesting because they explain gender inequality, especially in developed countries, apropos the previous discussion. So we really want to understand where they come from. But to make policy prescriptions, we want to be careful.
Hi, I'm Max, a PhD candidate at Berkeley. have you ever tried to put a price on household labor, kind of after birth, and what it would like if you did that, the graphs?
Have we tried to put a price on household labor, you said?
Yeah.
Home production? But the short answer is no. I'm not sure exactly specifically where you want to go, but that's not a route we've pursued.
Yeah, I mean, women probably do a lot of the labor in the household.
Yeah.
Right, and if we, right now it's often not priced.
Yeah.
In the market, so if we put a price on that, what would it look like?
So you would
be
use this
curious.
kind of variation to put a
Yeah, or
put a
in
price on
different
it, yeah.
countries,
Yeah.
that some of the gap might disappear.
yeah, possible.
Okay, I think our time is up. So let's first give Henrik.
Thank you.